Welcome to Using a Podcast. My name's Marlon, and this time capsules talk about disciplined news in the UK, explore the stories and give a little opinion. Although news outside the anticipated news, several people in news affects our lives is still underreported, and generally as many of us already know, we're 100% in the media. So the name of this podcast is an effort to try and address this balance. First news story is the government has announced plans to tackle the cost of living crisis for disabled adults. The minimum income guarantee payments going up in the major move. The government announced 7% increase to the minimum income guarantee. This means approximately 150,000 disabled adults who receive social care will keep at least £400 more of their income each year rather than being taken for care costs. Those who must be in need could see up to £510 savings. This is also announced benefit upgrading most disability benefits, including PPD line and attendance allowance, will be increased by 3.8% in line with inflation starting in April 2026. And also, home adaptations and 723 million investment into the disabled facilities grant was confirmed to fund home adaptations like ramps or wet ramps for roughly 60,000 people. Now, if you want something to be fairly positive and open with the voice of doom and gloom in the podcast in terms of especially things in relation to government spending, but hopefully this will go through and that's a positive thing, especially with all of it, particularly with care charges. They have increased exponentially in the last decade or so. However, let's not confuse that with more funding for actual social care. That means that, the care that people do get, we charge less, but doesn't necessarily mean that fair care they do get will be, will even continue, or that, if their needs aren't being met, that they'll be funded more for the actual social care than needs. It's not confuse the two things, but, it's a positive. It is a negative, but that is a positive. Also, the DFG grants, because there was talk of that being cut significantly. So the fact that they put more into that is a very positive thing. Although again, it's a different side to that. Home adaptations, well, we've got a problem with accessible homes, and we've already talked about several episodes about new homes, the lack of new homes, but then also the new homes that are being built to accessibility standards. So again, yes, more money for adaptations, but if homes being built to accessibility standards in the first place, then you wouldn't need to pay increased money for DFGs to begin with. But good that DFGs funding isn't being cut again. So there are positives there, and the benefits, obviously, that's in line with inflation. That's an increase, but they go up every year anyway. And also it's an increase, but cost of living's increase at the same time. So what does that turn out to be for? More money in the pocket, but more money in the pocket doesn't necessarily mean that that's sufficient money in the pocket. And they're two very different things. And again, this is a government press release, so it is going to be glowing in terms of what's being presented, but cost of living hasn't slowed down. Crisis hasn't gone anywhere, hasn't slowed down. Energy crisis hasn't slowed down. So whilst it's very much appreciated that people keep more money in their pockets, that's the difference between keeping money in your pocket and that money being sufficient to provide you with a lot of the means your financial needs, or even the minimum standards. So we'll keep an eye on that, but positive nonetheless. The next is a very interesting story. It's about a non-horror TV news investigation released this week that has caused significant outcry because of the use of what's been seen as punitive use of contact orders. More than 100 families reported that their visiting rights were restricted or entirely banned after they complained about poor or neglect care in residential settings. And this is families of those with learning disabilities. I assume it's in care homes or supported living settings, residential settings. Advocates, including the Change of Behaviour Foundation, warned of a trend where contact orders meant to protect the vulnerable are being used by local authorities to silence families. Again, Mr. Steve McKinnon called findings completely acceptable and heartbreaking, promising that the Department of Health and Social Care will take action to ensure CQC regulations on family access are followed. Yeah, this is shocking if it's true. It'd be interesting to see where this goes. Well, there must be some truth in it, obviously, and there'll be court documents, etc., and so forth. So you just hope it's not a nationwide trend, really, and we see where this goes, really, and CQC get involved, etc., and so forth. Wasn't that long ago that I think ITV News also did an investigation on a local authority where they had learned disabled adults in residential facilities. When it came to review the care, they were accused of not doing mental capacity assessments, but also not including providers or family members in reviews. And then, obviously, looking to cut costs. They highlighted, ITV's highlighted that as well, so it seems that there's, all sorts of things going on, which was bad, isn't that unexpected for many disabled people. The interactions with local authorities, obviously, we know there's a cash crisis and there's a social care funding crisis. There's obviously lawful ways of conducting assessments, etc., and so forth, and these practices, if that's what's happening, are unlawful. And obviously, governments and Parliament in general need to find ways around this, because ultimately, it's not going anywhere. Social care isn't going anywhere. It's always going to be needed. If anything, it's more so needed now than ever. So this funding solution is a conundrum. Need to find a solution. That's in everyone's interest, really. I know people keep saying that they can't afford it. They can't afford it. Ultimately, social care creates an awful lot of jobs. And in terms of entrepreneurship, like a lot of these providers, good, bad, indifferent, and there's all sorts of on the spectrum in terms of good, bad, and indifferent. But ultimately, they also provide, what the industry, should I say, provides one of the few aspects of homegrown entrepreneurship in terms of £1 million homegrown companies. Millions. Sorry, let me re-say that. In terms of entrepreneurship, that's one aspect of entrepreneurship that, that this country actually produces in terms of care. Now, whatever you feel about that, that's a fact. The reality is ultimately people are always going to need care, and always going to need a good standard of care, and so it makes more sense in my mind to provide that funding, because ultimately you're creating jobs. It's not as if so people are being given that money and it's not going anywhere else. It's literally going back into the system, because that money is paying for wages. Ultimately, I know that companies make profits, but they make accumulative profits per head. When you put in, especially in terms of residential care, especially in terms of healthcare, when you look at actual, as much as costs are high, staff values are as well. So ultimately, on a case by case basis, there's not the same profits as there were, say, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Just ultimately the costs of eating into that, and also in terms of providers, as we talked about before, cost of living crisis has hit them as well, because obviously domestic markets have had some kind of growth, although not enough. Businesses haven't had any kind of protection, that level of protection in terms of domestic, in terms of costs of fuel, energy, etc. and so forth. So they've been hit by that as well. Also, in terms of the local authorities, are struggling. Some are even in bankruptcy. Already know. So ultimately, the costs they've incurred in terms of individuals living there, in terms of the contributions that the local authority give in terms of the living costs, on top of the staffing costs, are often hardly enough to sustain adequate cost of living, which is going to be higher for those individuals anyway because of their needs. So ultimately, the great massive profits that they make are cumulative based upon the amount of individuals they care for, rather than an individual one-to-one package, regardless of kind of how big that package is really, because ultimately the cost of that package usually, in terms of staffing, the level of care someone needs, say for instance they need 2-to-1, 3-to-1, maybe 4-to-1 care, which is extreme case. Say for instance there's a level of staffing to that, and there's the NI's gone up, etc. and so forth. So even in those cases, yes, there are some massive care packages, and I'm not saying there's not, but ultimately there's a need there. That need isn't going anywhere, and it's the cumulative amount of packages that make these providers money, hence the reason why they often buy up all the companies around them, and a lot of their assets and properties in terms of property development, and get as many people into buildings and etc. and so forth. So ultimately, as much as they have their own motives, and I'm not defending care companies, I'm basically saying that in terms of the actual need for individuals' care to be paid for, to me, is a zero-sum game, because ultimately most of that profit, most of those funds go towards staffing people. Care, which means providing jobs, and the one thing we have in this country is a jobs crisis, and you take away health and social care, particularly care, away from the employment roster, and you've got a significantly worse crisis than you have at the moment. So I never really understood kind of this resident need to kind of residents to fund social care in particular, because to be honest, a lot of people that rely on that in terms of employment, there's very limited options in terms of the employment they can get, where they can earn the same kind of money that they're doing in social care, and the same kind of opportunities in terms of development as well. So yeah, never really understood. More major welfare reform news. Significant legislation was laid in Parliament on February the 9th and 10th, seeking the start from massive level the disability benefit system. New people activity rule. Claimants will now need to score at least 4 points in a single activity to qualify for the daily living element for Alton. Cumulative 8 points across the minute. And the Universal Credit Health Court, the monthly health element for new claimants will be caught from approximately £430 to £217. And I've said so many times about disability assessment and benefits thing needs to be thrown in the bin and start again, to be honest. The courts from 432.17 is massive. It's absolutely huge. It's going to impact a lot of people. And the new point system, well, basically, people is really, let's be honest. And as I've said previously, I've been to one of these assessments for a very long time. But from what from my recollection of how it was before, I've said before, I don't see what, in terms of work capability in particular, what those assessments really have to do with the day-to-day nature of work and how you can signify any sweet plate in the office, in which case the people don't need to be there. Those assessments have to do with day-to-day work and the tasks that you're doing work in terms of different types of work you can do, etc. and so forth, touching your toes or whatever, or lifting something in the air, it's something to do with quite vast arrays of work that one would do, particularly in terms of cognitive functioning, etc. and so forth. So I think they're very flawed and it's designed to be flawed in my opinion, I think, ultimately. And the goods and wars can happen, and there's a bit more ahead, but I just think, ultimately, people with long-term conditions where you can, and the massive health history, GPs, hospital appointments, consultants, etc. and so forth, it's pretty much open a case as to whether their conditions, how they affect them, etc. and so forth. And I just don't see the need for so many assessments and yearly assessments, 2 year assessments, even 3 year assessments. It should be permanent in terms of people, etc. and so forth. In terms of capability to work, where if there's no jobs, you can be as capable as you want. You ain't going to work anywhere. And ultimately, like I've said previously before, if you're destroying access to work, and employers still 30 years after access to work or whatever it is, still don't know much about disability and are scared to hire disabled people. Well, I'm created the environment for disabled people to get into work even if they could. So I just think it's all a bit of a farce, all a bit ridiculous. It's all about kind of pleasing, I don't know if it's middle class Britain, whether it's the political grandees, whoever he is, I don't know who he is, they're trying to appease, but they're not trying to help disabled people, because as we've seen, as we know, like I said, the work well scheme, for instance, it's meant to be this scheme where you get access to health services to help people get into work or to find work. Well, if that's so easy to do in pilots, well, why is access to work finding? Ultimately, because if you can prove you can do it in those pilots, you can do it across the board. And if you've got employers that are willing to engage in that process, why can't you do that nationally? And ultimately, for that to work anyway, you need access to work that brings if it works anyway. So, they just got in here and introducing things there, and nothing fits and nothing marries. And like I've said 1,000 times, unless you have political strategies that all knit together, all interwove, and you fix education, you fix health, you fix social care, you fix employment, and you marry all those policies together across the board for everybody, nothing will change. Because ultimately, nothing works in a vacuum, everything works in tandem. So, to me, so all of those things get addressed nationwide for everybody, then never mind looking at disabled people. And that's stories and accessibility. Alton Towers U-turns unplanned to distribute disability pass. Rail Entertainment has backtracked on its controversial plan to tighten access to its disability queuing system at its theme parks, following strong criticisms from people with autism, ADHD and anxiety. The company had planned to introduce new eligibility for its right access pass, RAP, which prefers a non-queuing option for people unable to stand in long lines. Under the plan, visitors to places like Alton Towers, Chessington Water Adventures and Legoland Windsor this afternoon, who quoted difficulty with crowds would no longer have qualified. Merlin said he had listened carefully to the extensive feedback and decided to pause the trial while we explored alternative options. The theme park owner addressed those people impacted, quote unquote, by their previous announcement, saying, "We are sorry." The move sparked what upset amongst adults with autism, ADHD, and anxiety, with families of neurodivergent children who said the changes for shutting many people out of the system they rely on. More than 25,000 people signed an online petition urging the company to reverse the plan. Merlin announced on Thursday that it will not go ahead with the trial for an extensive feedback. Yeah, it's good news that they've U-turned in it. I can imagine they probably, no surprise there wasn't that quiet. But also, it's a bit of a difficult one because depending on how they bet it, I know that people are passes, etc. and so forth, they're always going to get those people that say, "Oh, so-and-so doesn't look this, so-and-so doesn't look that." And probably have feedback, especially in what we talked about already with the welfare crisis and everything else for people, and people, so-and-so looks the same, so-and-so's not disabled, so-and-so's challenged, etc. and so forth. That probably feeds into that. They've probably got fights going on in Alton Towers of people, arguing who looks disabled and who's worthy, who's not worthy, in terms of queuing and whatever. So they probably get a lot of backlash over that, and, especially with that whole anxiety thing, people, the government weaponising mental health and then talking about anxiety as if it's nothing. So they're probably reacting to that, to be fair. Not that they should have done what they've done, but, gladly that they're going back on it, and because, from those experience that, especially neurodiversity, that would have been absolute extra handbrake on along with that, and probably would have destroyed the business, because ultimately, especially with neurodivergent anxiety, very often, if not always, go hand in hand. So if you're going to have, people waiting in queues, it would have been ultimately, especially with young children, you would have had a situation where they would have just drove a lot of customers away from their business ultimately. And I'm not saying they were planning what they were planning because of they were jumping on the anti-benefits welfare bandwagon. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I'm not surprised that they probably would have come up with something that was that short-sighted, because they probably get feedback from people saying, so-and-so or so-and-so waiting there, they don't look like this and that, because that's how people judge things out, and that's how divisive their benefits, who's disabled, who's worthy, who's not worthy is got. But all in all, they paused it for now, and hopefully that pause will, be a full stop. But it wouldn't surprise me if they tried it again. Ultimately, doing it half term seems like a bit of a weird move as well. But, just hope that they find a different way.